The Velmaran sent 4 billion love signals. Convoy Ardent 9 answered with 14 guns. The signal came in on a Tuesday. Specialist Kale Voss knew it was a Tuesday, because Tuesday was the day the galley served reconstituted mushroom broth, and the smell of it had been working its way through the ventilation shafts of IN's unbroken ground. The better part of an hour. He was sitting in the signals bay on deck 7, one boot off, having a blister that had formed on his left heel sometime during the emergency drill 3 nights ago, when the board lit up like someone had dropped a match into a fireworks warehouse. He stared at it for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to confirm it wasn't a test, long enough to confirm it wasn't an equipment malfunction, long enough for his brain to cycle through the 6 or 7 explanations that lived in the comfortable, daylit portion of his understanding and find that none of them fit. Then he put his boot back on and called Lieutenant Saradine. "Lieutenant," he said when she picked up, "you need to see the board. I'm eating, I know. You still need to see it." There was a pause. The sound of a spoon against a ceramic bowl. "How bad?" Kale looked at the board. The numbers were still climbing. The signal was still coming. It had been coming, he was realizing, for somewhere between 6 and 12 minutes before his instruments had finished triangulating it and decided it was real enough to flag. Whatever was sending it had been patient about the opening, had let it build slowly, like a tide coming in, until it was simply too large to mistake for background noise. "It's not bad," he said, because that was technically accurate. "It's very big." Lieutenant Saradine arrived in the signals bay 4 minutes later with half a bread roll still in her hand. She was a tall woman, angular in the way of people who had spent their whole adult lives in partial gravity, close-cropped gray hair that had been gray since she was 32. She did not panic. In Kale's 8 months aboard unbroken ground, he had never seen her panic. He had seen her angry twice and frightened once briefly, when a coolant pressure gauge had read something it absolutely should not have read. But panic was not a register she seemed to have access to. She looked at the board. She ate the rest of her bread roll. She said, "Pull up the frequency analysis." Kale pulled up the frequency analysis. The signal was broadcasting on 17 distinct channels simultaneously, which was the first strange thing. Each channel carried a slightly different version of the same basic pattern. A long, sweeping tone that rose in pitch over approximately 40 seconds, then descended, then paused, then rose again. Not identical. The variations were subtle, the way variations in handwriting are subtle. The same letter, written by the same hand, in different moods. "It's talking," Kale said, before he could stop himself. Saradine did not tell him he was being dramatic. Run it against the contact library. He ran it against the contact library. The contact library was a database maintained by the Joint Fleet Intelligence Directorate. Every confirmed, suspected alien signal event in recorded human history, which was not as many as civilians tended to imagine. 41 confirmed contacts, 19 suspected. The confirmed ones ranged from simple navigational beacons, left by whatever had seeded outer relay systems 3,000 years before humanity reached them, to the screaming broadband pulse that the Ardent class destroyer, IN's Corrigan's Promise, had intercepted in the Lathe Corridor 11 years ago, 30 seconds before whatever had made the pulse had destroyed Fearig. Corrigan's Promise, and everything within 40,000 kilometers of it. The library returned no match. "Nothing," Kale said. Saradine nodded, as if this was the answer she had been expecting. "Get me the convoy frequency. I need to talk to Fleet Captain Uda." Convoy Ardent 9 was not a military convoy. Technically, though it had military escort, it was a resupply chain. 12 freighters carrying agricultural equipment, water reclamation components, prefabricated habitat modules, and approximately 40,000 tons of enriched grain to the settlement colonies in the Edrin Reach. The kind of convoy that kept 300,000 people alive through another winter without requiring them to ration anything they shouldn't have. Ration. The kind of convoy that moved slowly because the freighters were old and their drives were efficient but not fast, and that broadcast its position clearly. Because colonial supply convoys were protected under about 15 different intersecting treaties, And there was supposed to be nothing in this corridor worth hiding from. There were 4 warships in the escort formation. Unbroken ground. The smallest. A signals and surveillance frigate, technically a warship but built more for watching than for fighting, though she had 14 gun emplacements and a full complement of long-range strike packages. The 3 larger ships were IN's Relentless Acre, a medium destroyer, IN's Pale Argument, a heavy cruiser that was technically 2 years past her recommended refit date, but had been cleared for active deployment anyway, and the convoy flagship, Fiend's Voice of Covenant, which was a line battleship of the Threshold class, 900 meters of layered kinetic armor, and enough weapons systems to hold a conversation with a small moon. Cale had never been on a convoy where nothing happened. He had been on 4. On the first, a freighter's drive had blown out and they'd spent 11 days nursing it back to operational, while the rest of the convoy circled. On the second, they'd intercepted a piracy attempt. 3 modified mining vessels whose operators had badly misjudged the response capabilities of a convoy escort and had discovered their mistake at a cost Cale tried not to think about too precisely. On the third, a navigation error had put them within 40 kilometers of a debris field from an old colony ship, and the frigate's hull had taken 3 small impacts before they'd found their way through. On none of them had every instrument in the signals bay lit up simultaneously, with a broadcast on 17 channels that matched nothing in any database. He was beginning to suspect this was the one that would define the rest of them. Fleet Captain Uda's face on the comm screen was exactly the face Cale had expected. Calm in the way that experienced officers were calm was not really the same as being calm at all. It was calm as a practice, calm as a discipline, calm as a choice made consciously every few seconds. "How long has it been broadcasting?" Uda asked. "We picked it up 20 minutes ago," Saradine said. "Best estimate from signal strength and propagation patterns, it started 9 to 14 minutes before that." "Origin point? That's the part I wanted to talk to you about, sir." Saradine nodded to Cale. Cale put the trajectory map on the screen. He'd spent the last 15 minutes refining it, rechecking his calculations, running them twice more because he hadn't trusted the first results, and then a third time because he hadn't trusted the second either. They all said the same thing. "The signal is originating from approximately 600,000 kilometers ahead of the convoy's current position," he said. "Based on Doppler analysis and the signal strength gradient over the last 20 minutes, the source is moving toward us. Approximately," he paused, because the number still felt surreal to say aloud, "at approximately 60% of light speed." The silence on the line lasted 5 seconds. 60%, Uda said. "Yes, sir. That's nothing we have goes 60%. Yes, sir. The fastest military drive in current deployment achieves about 38 in a sprint, and you can't sustain it. So whatever it is, built up that velocity somewhere else. It's been in transit. For a long time, probably. Yes, sir." Uda was quiet for another moment. Cale watched her face on the screen and thought about what must be like to be sitting in the command chair of a battleship and have someone tell you that something was coming at 60% of light speed from 600,000 kilometers away. At that velocity, with no deceleration, the time to contact was 350 seconds, Saradine said, reading his mind. "Just under 6 minutes to closest approach if it doesn't slow down." "And it hasn't slowed down?" "Not detectably, sir. Not yet." "All right," said. "General quarters, all convoy ships. And someone tell me what the signal actually says." The signal, as best Cale could determine, said, "Shh. Hello." He was aware that this was an absurd interpretation and held it lightly, but there was a structure to it that he kept returning to. The 17 channels were not carrying 17 different messages. They were carrying 17 variations on a single gesture, tone that rose, held, and descended. He'd mapped it against every analytical framework in the signals library. Cipher analysis, mathematical encoding, biological pattern matching, language acquisition models. Nothing stuck cleanly. But when he ran it through the emotion mapping module that the HFY-I had added to the contact library 3 years ago, a project that had been, he now it recalled, Fairly controversial, because it required making significant assumptions about the universality of certain signal structures. It turned a result with a confidence level of 63%. 63% was low. 63% was the kind of number that you did not lead with in a briefing if you wanted to be taken seriously. 63%. Greeting inquiry contact seeking. The module had a supplementary note attached, added by whoever had written the emotion mapping framework. He read it twice. This category of signal structure appears in the contact records of 7 of the 41 confirmed alien signal events. In 4 of those cases, subsequent interaction was hostile. In 2 it was neutral. In 1 it was cooperative. In all 7 cases, the signal preceded direct contact by a period of between 3 minutes and 40 seconds and 11 minutes and 12 seconds. If you are reading the notes in real time, please notify HFY-Infinity immediately and ensure your vessel is at combat readiness. Kale notified Jeff ID. He also made sure his station was strapped in because General Quarfers had sounded 2 minutes ago, and the standing order was that all non-essential personnel be at their stations with harnesses engaged. And he was not technically essential to the operation of the frigate's weapons systems, and therefore was technically non-essential, but he was also the signals specialist. And this was a signals event of a kind that had never happened before in recorded human history, so he was staying at his station, and he was strapping in, and he was going to keep watching the board. The numbers on the board kept climbing. 2. The procession it decelerated. Kale had been watching the Doppler shift with the fixation of a man who has run out of anything else he can usefully do, and he saw the moment it changed. The way the numbers began to compress, the leading edge of the signal shortening, the source dropping from 60% to 54% in the space of 40 seconds. He called Saradine immediately. It's slowing down. I see it. That's? He tried to find the right framing. That's good? It's not going to just pass through us. It's either good or it's very bad, Saradine said. It's slowing down because it wants to stop. We don't know yet whether it wants to stop near us or at us. The distinction was not subtle, 43%. 31. The deceleration was enormous. He couldn't account for how it was doing it, because the energy expenditure implied by slowing from 60% to 30% in under 2 minutes was beyond anything in his working models. Should have been producing a thermal signature the size of a small star. He was getting nothing on thermals, nothing on EM except the signal. Whatever was carrying that signal, it operated on principles that his instruments either couldn't detect or hadn't been designed to look for. 18%, 11.6. At 6% of light speed, they got their first visual. It was not one thing. He had been expecting one thing, one ship, one vessel, one object. The origin point of the signal had resolved as a single point source, and he had been thinking in terms of a ship because ship was the category his mind had available for. Object moving through space bearing signal. He had not been thinking in terms of a school, a flock, a murmuration. How many? Saradine's voice was very steady. Kale counted, stopped, started again. I can't get a firm count. They're moving in formation, but the formation is changing. It's not a rigid structure. They're moving relative to each other. He looked at the visual again. The shapes were not identical, which was the second thing that surprised him. Different sizes, different configurations, a loose, flowing geometry, like a vast hand opening. Estimate, Saradine said. At least 300 distinct objects, possibly significantly more. Some of the smaller ones may be. He hesitated. Some of the smaller ones may be biological. I'm getting heat signatures that look organic. Biological. Like animals, Lieutenant. Like animals moving in a formation alongside the ships. Or whatever the ships are. He looked at the visual again and thought, a procession. Word arrived in his mind and stuck there. Not a fleet. Not an armada, a procession. Something that moved the way a significant occasion moved. Ceremony. With weight. With the sense that it had been a long time in coming and the arrival was itself the message. Terrace. Voice of covenant. Is asking for your best count, Saradine said. Kale looked at the board. Tell Fleet, Captain Uda, that she's looking at a minimum of 300 objects, and that they are sending the same signal they have been sending since first contact. and that as of this moment, they have stopped decelerating. They are now moving at approximately 4% of light speed and holding. Holding, Saradine repeated. Holding, they've stopped. They're waiting. The convoy held position too. This was not an automatic decision. Fleet Captain Uda consulted with the captains of all 4 escort ships via encrypted tight beam in the 6 minutes after the Velmaran procession, which was what the communications log was already calling them, because Kale had needed to call them in his reports, and the word had stuck. Came to rest 400 kilometers off the convoy's port bow. She consulted with them and she consulted with the HFY duty officer via the emergency relay, who told her with considerable urgency that this was above his clearance and she should do nothing provocative, and that a response team was being assembled, and she asked how long the response team would take. And the duty officer said possibly 4 hours, and Auda thanked him and closed the channel. Then she consulted with the captains again for another 2 minutes. Then she sent orders to the convoy: hold position, maintain defensive formation, weapons free but do not engage. And someone please figure out what that signal is saying. The someone was KL. He knew it was going to be him before Saradine told him. He had known it was going to be him from the moment the board had lit up, because there were 4 signal specialists across the convoy escort. And he had been working on alien contact linguistics as a secondary project since he was 18 years old, which was not something that the other 3 signal specialists had been doing. And when something happened that required someone to think about alien contact linguistics, the universe had a way of finding the one person who had been quietly preparing for it. He was 26. He had been preparing for 8 years. He had never expected it to actually happen. He had a theory about what the signal was doing, and it was not the theory he had expected to have. It's not a first contact protocol, he told Saradine, 2 hours into his analysis. Or it is, but it's not designed to build communication from scratch. It's not trying to establish shared mathematical primitives or establish a shared referent, any of the other things you'd expect if they were approaching us as a genuinely unknown quantity. Saradine was at her station across the bay. She had not left since general quarters sounded. Neither had he. Someone had brought them both food at some point. The containers were pushed to the side, mostly untouched. What is it doing then? It's assuming we already know what it means. Pulled up his analysis. Look at the structure. The rising tone, the sustained peak, the descent. That's not a mathematical demonstration. That's a greeting. A very specific kind of greeting. It's the kind of thing you do when you're approaching someone who knows what a greeting looks like. You don't explain that a greeting is a greeting. You just do it and you trust that the other party understands the register. They think they've met us before. Or they think they're meeting us for the first time. They assume that we understand the concept of approach, of announcement, of peaceful contact seeking. They're not starting from zero. They're starting from. He searched for the word. From shared assumptions. They think we speak the same language in some deeper sense than words. Saradine was quiet for a moment. Or they're very confident that we can't hurt them. This had occurred to him. Yes, that's the other interpretation. Which do you think it is? Kale looked at the board. The signal was still coming. 17 channels. The same patient, rising tone. They had been transmitting it for over 2 hours now, without variation, without impatience, without any indication that the lack of response was bothering them. If they were waiting for an answer, they were very comfortable waiting. I don't know, he said, honestly, but I think we should answer anyway. The debate about whether to answer took 40 minutes and involved Fleet Captain Oda, both her senior officers, the captains of the 3 escort ships, and via relay, 3 people from HFY-I who had each been patched in from different locations and were clearly not in the same room as each other. Kale was invited to present his analysis, and then asked to wait on a different channel while the decision was made. He waited on a different channel for 40 minutes and watched the signal. The signal was, he had come to believe, beautiful. He would not have said this to anyone aboard. It was not the kind of observation that a junior signals specialist was supposed to make about an unknown alien contact that might or might not be a prelude to a hostile encounter, and he was already aware that his theory about the greeting as greeting was not universally accepted, and adding, also, it's beautiful, to his credibility ledger was not going to help. But he thought it privately and let himself think it. There was something in the way the 17 channels related to each other that was not random. The variations between them were not noise. They were the way that meaning could be meant, in 17 slightly different ways simultaneously. The way a single word in one language could require a paragraph in another to capture all of its implications. And this signal was doing all of those implications at once, layering them the way overtones layered in a chord. He had been trying to parse them individually and failing, and he had only recently started to understand that they were meant to be received all at once, the way music was meant to be received, not note by note but as a simultaneous structure. It was saying, hello, in 17 different emotional registers at the same time, which was an extraordinary thing to do when he thought about it. It was saying, we know that hello is complicated. We know that the way you greet something depends on what you feel about it, what you hope from it, what you fear. We are giving you all of our hellos at once, so that you can find the one that fits. He thought. They've done this before. They have greeted things before, and some of those things were afraid, and some were hostile, and some were curious, and some were cold and indifferent, and they have developed a greeting that reaches all of them. Feet, he thought. They have been very lonely, or they have been very busy, and possibly both. Saradine called him back to the main channel. We're going to respond, she said. Fleet Captain Uda has authorized a return signal. Basic mathematical acknowledgement to start. Prime sequence. Standard first contact protocol. Your job is to build up from there if they respond in kind. What if they don't respond in kind? Then you document everything, and we accelerate the convoy to emergency speed and run for the Edrin Reach as fast as the freighters can manage. And the weapons? Still free. Still not engaged. Right, he took a breath. Tell the captain I'm starting the sequence. Part 3. Call and answer. The prime sequence took 4 minutes to transmit. It was not elegant. It was the first contact equivalent of handing someone a piece of paper with your name written on it. Technically informative. Designed to demonstrate mathematical capability, rather than to convey anything meaningful. Dave Fee had refined it twice in the last decade, based on the contact library. But it was still, at its core, a blunt instrument. We exist. We are mathematically literate. We are trying to communicate. The Velmoran procession listened to it. Then they responded. They did not respond with a prime sequence. They did not respond with a mathematical demonstration of any kind. They responded by changing the frequency of their signal, not abruptly, gradually, over about 30 seconds until it matched the exact frequency of the prime sequence Kale had just transmitted, and then they embedded something in it. Something new. Something that was not the greeting. Kale stared at the analysis for a long moment before he understood what he was looking at. Lieutenant, he said. What is it? They've matched our transmission frequency, and they've embedded a response in it. There. He ran the analysis again. They're using our own transmission protocol as a carrier wave. They're talking to us in our own technical language. How is that possible? I know. We just transmitted for the first time. They analyzed our signal in 4 minutes, and they've already learned to use our own protocol. He paused. That's what that means. That's the answer to my question. About why they think we speak the same language in some deeper sense. They don't. They don't assume we speak the same language. They just learn the language very quickly. What's the message? He worked through it. It was not straightforward. They had learned the carrier protocol, but they were not using it to transmit anything that mapped onto human linguistic or mathematical conventions. They were using the carrier as a structure and filling it with their own content. Was like using the rules of a language's grammar to speak a completely different language. It made it at once decodable in structure and opaque in content. But there was one thing he could decode. One thing that was structured in a way that mapped cleanly. It was a number. 4 billion, he said. 4 billion what? I'm not sure. It's a quantity. A very specific quantity. 4 billion, 312 million, 744,000. 118. They're saying this number and I don't know what it refers to. Saradine was quiet. Does the number mean anything to you? Kale looked at it, turned it over. It's not a stellar coordinate. It's not a distance in any obvious unit. It's not— Wait. He paused. Tenant. How long has our species been producing radio transmissions? Detectable ones. Ones that would have propagated into space. She didn't answer immediately. He could tell she was calculating. Call it 140 years of truly detectable EM. Before that, weak early broadcasts that might propagate a few light years. So, maybe 160 years total of anything a sufficiently sensitive receiver might pick up. 160 years. He looked at the number again. At the rate our early transmissions propagated, and the rate we've been increasing EM output since then. He was pulling up models now, triangulating. 160 years of increasing broadcast output. A very rough model of the total number of distinct signals we've produced would be. Model returned a number. It was not precise, it was an estimate with enormous error bars. But the order of magnitude was right. They've been listening to us, he said. 4 billion signals. They've received and cataloged 4 billion distinct human transmissions. That's what that number is. That's what they're telling us. That's the answer to— Hello. Telling us how long they've been listening. They're telling us they know us. The silence in the signal's bay was complete. How far out would they have to have been? Saradine said very quietly. To have signals from 160 years ago. 160 light years minimum. Probably more. Signals degrade over distance. So to have received and cataloged 4 billion distinct ones, they'd need to have been close enough for the signal to be distinguishable from background noise. I'd estimate, he ran it, 220 light years, give or take 50. They've been sitting 200 light years away, listening to us, for 160 years. And they've never contacted us before. No. He looked at the board. They've been waiting for something. He spent the next 3 hours talking to them. Chand, he said. Loosely. There was very little that was mutual about it, in the conventional sense. He would transmit something, working with the structure they had provided, trying to build meaning out of the combination of their carrier adaptation and his own attempts to respond to specific elements of their earlier signals. And they would respond. And each response would teach him something about how they meant things, and he would adjust his next transmission accordingly. It was less a conversation and more the experience of learning a language by total immersion, except that the language was not quite a language, and the immersion was bidirectional. And somewhere in the third hour he became aware that they were doing the same thing he was doing, that this was mutual, that they were learning him as he was learning them. That was when he understood what they were, not what they looked like, not what they wanted, though he was beginning to have a sense of that too. What they— Crick. A category of thing in the universe. What kind of entity sent a procession of 300-plus ships traveling at 60% of light speed to park 400 kilometers off the bow of a civilian resupply convoy and say, hello, in 17 emotional registers simultaneously? The kind of entity that had been alone for a very long time. Not alone in the sense of isolated. The procession itself suggested a society, a community, a civilization of significant scale. Alone in the sense of not having found anyone else to talk to. The kind of entity that had spent 160 years listening to human radio transmissions, love songs and news broadcasts and emergency frequencies and entertainment signals and shipping manifests and military communications and scientific research and political arguments and every other form of noise a civilization produced, and had learned everything they could learn from them, and had still been on the outside looking in. The kind of entity that had finally decided to close the distance. The greeting that said, hello. In 17 registers, he now understood, was the greeting of something that had been rehearsing it for 160 years. I need to tell the fleet captain something, Kale said to Saradine, in the brief break he'd taken to eat half of his cold food. I need to tell her what I think they want. What do you think they want? He thought about how to say it. They want to be known. They've been watching us for 160 years, and they know everything about us that can be learned from the outside, from observation, from the signals we make when we're not thinking about being observed. And they've decided, I think, this is my best interpretation, could be wrong, that this is not enough, that they want to close the loop. They want us to know them back. Saradine looked at him for a moment. That's either the most moving thing I've heard in my career or it's a very sophisticated deception. I know. The 4 billion signals. The fact that they know us, that could be the setup for something. A demonstration of capability. We have watched you for 160 years and you never knew. And we are telling you this, so you understand that you are entirely known to us, and we are entirely unknown to you, and you should be afraid. Yes, Kale said. That's the other interpretation, and I don't have a way to prove it's wrong. But you think it's wrong. I think the signal is what it looks like. I think they've been lonely for a very long time, I think. He stopped. I think the reason they approached a supply convoy and not a military installation is because they've listened to enough human communications to know that a supply convoy going to feed 300,000 colonists is a safer first contact than a weapons platform. I think they know us well enough to know the difference. Saradine was quiet for a long moment. Tell Fleet Captain Oda everything, she said. All of it. Your interpretation and the alternative. And then she decides part 4. The answer Fleet Captain Uda's decision took 20 minutes. Kale had expected it to take longer. He had expected more consultation, more argument, relay calls to HFY-I. But HFY-I's response team was still 2 hours out, and Uda had sent 2 updates and received 2 responses that essentially said, maintain current posture and do not escalate, without adding anything useful, and at some point maintaining current posture required making a decision about what to do next, and the decision was hers. She called Kale directly on a tight beam channel, not through Saradine. Him, Specialist Voss. You've been talking to them for 3 hours. Yes, sir. And your read is that they've been listening to us for 160 years. That's my best interpretation of the 4 billion figure, sir. Yes. And you think they're here because they want us to know them the way they know us. Yes, sir. What does that look like? Practically, what does that mean? When you translate it into something we could actually do. He had thought about this. He had been thinking about it for the last hour. It means talking, sir. Not in the diplomatic protocol sense, in the sense that they've heard 4 billion human signals and they know what a shipping manifest sounds like, and what a love song sounds like, and what an emergency beacon sounds like, and what a military briefing sounds like. They know the whole spectrum. They're asking us to know their spectrum. We'd need time. Yes, sir, a lot of time. What we've managed in 3 hours is it's a beginning, just a beginning. Uda was quiet for a moment. The freighters, colonists in the Edrin Reach. Sir, I'm responsible for getting that cargo to the Edrin Reach. That is my mission. I can't park this convoy 400 kilometers from an alien procession indefinitely while my signals specialist learns to talk to them. I know. So, another pause. Here's what I'm going to propose. Tell me if it's possible. She laid it out. Kale transmitted the proposal in the structure he'd been developing over the last 3 hours. It was complicated because what he was proposing required expressing the concept of a promise, of a commitment made now that would be honored later, which was not something he had figured out how to express yet in the framework they'd built together. He tried 3 different approaches. First 2 came back with responses he interpreted as confusion. The third came back with something new. They had understood the concept of promise. They had, it seemed, a version of it. The responses embedded a structure he hadn't seen before, a kind of doubling or mirroring that seemed to indicate reciprocity. We will also. Then the number 4 was repeated 3 times in a configuration he had come to associate with specificity, with precision, Tigers and Story. This exact thing and not another thing. He sat with it for several minutes, checked his interpretation, checked it again. Lieutenant, he said, I think they've agreed, and I think they're telling us they'll wait. They'll be here. When we come back. When we come back, Saradine said. Convoy does the Idrin reach run, delivers the cargo, returns on the same route. Standard turnaround is, what, 12 weeks? 11, typically. 11 weeks, they're telling us they'll be here in 11 weeks. He looked at the signal. It was still going. 17 channels, the greeting. But there was something different in it now, a quality he hadn't been able to name before. And he realized that he could name it now, or at least approach the edges of naming it. It felt like waiting. It felt like something that had already waited a long time, settling in to wait a little more, but differently. Not alone in the dark, but with the knowledge that someone was coming back. Part 5. Sure. The convoy moved at 0400 ship time. Kale was still at his station. He had not slept. Saradine had told him twice that he should sleep, and he had agreed both times and not slept. He had eaten, eventually, which was something. He had written up his analysis, 18 pages of it, appendices, the most thorough report he had ever produced, and sent it to Saradine and Fleet Captain Uda, and, via emergency relay, to HFY-D with the header. Priority first contact event ongoing. He had also, in the margins of his analysis, in a section that was not technically part of the report, written some notes for himself, about what he thought they were, about the 17 channels, about the 4 billion signals, and what it meant to listen to something for 160 years. About the greeting that assumed shared understanding, and the patience of something that had been on the outside of a world it had studied for longer than Kale had been alive. Freighters began to move. He felt the unbroken ground shift beneath him as the frigate adjusted to escort formation. Slow, the old drives working at their measured pace, reliable and undramatic. He kept his instruments on the Velmoran procession. Watched the signal. Watched the visual. 322 distinct objects. His final count, arranged in that loose and changing geometry that he had come to think of, not as a formation, but as a shape. The shape that a community made when it moved together. The shape did not move. The Velmoran procession held its position, 400 kilometers off the receding convoy's port bow, and sent its signal. The signal was saying goodbye. He was nearly certain of it now. The greeting had changed. Not its structure, but its quality, the same way a sentence could be the same words in a different tone. It had the weight of a departure, of something that was watching someone leave. He almost transmitted a response. He had his hand over the controls for a moment. Then he took his hand away. Not because he didn't want to, because he had decided, in the long sleepless hours of the past day, that the right response to being watched patiently for 160 years was not to say something quick and then go. The right response was to come back, to take the 11 weeks and spend them preparing something worth saying, to show up again with more than a prime sequence and a promise. He would come back with something worthy of the wait. He slept for 6 hours and woke to Saradine telling him that Jave had established a direct contact channel and was demanding that he write an immediate expanded briefing, which he did over the next 4 hours. A team of 22 people from the Directorate's First Contact Division were being assembled, she told him, and would be joining the convoy's return run. A dedicated translation unit, xenolinguists, signal theorists, people who had spent careers preparing for exactly this. He was relieved and slightly territorial about this in equal measure, in a way that he decided was petty and tried to let go of. They'll be in charge of the return contact, Saradine said. You'll be on their team. I know. It's a good outcome, Voss. You open the door. They open the door, he said. They've been standing outside it for 160 years. He thought about it. I just answered when they knocked. Saradine nodded. She seemed to consider saying something further and then didn't. He looked at his station. The board was quiet. The 17-channel signal was no longer in range. They had been moving for 8 hours, and the signal was beyond the frigate's reception capability. But he had the full recording. He'd been listening to it in the background while he wrote the briefing, letting it run. 17 voices, 17 tones, the same patience, the same reaching quality, the same thing that had made him think, lonely. Before he understood that lonely wasn't quite the right word. The right word was closer to longing, to ready. 2. Here, finally, after all this time here. He shut the recording down and turned back to the briefing. 11 weeks. He had 11 weeks to become someone worth talking to. He opened a new file and started writing. Part 6. Return the Edrin Reach delivery took 12 days. The HFY-I team arrived on day 3. 14 of them, not 22. Because apparently the First Contact Division staffing had been restructured twice in the last decade and was not quite the robust enterprise it had been projected to become. They were led by a Dr. Ami Soon, who was in her mid-50s and had spent 30 years preparing for a contact event that everyone around her had been increasingly confident was not coming in her lifetime, and who responded to the news that it had come with an equanimity that Kale found both impressive and slightly unnerving. She had been ready for this. She had always been ready. She spent 4 hours going through his analysis and asked precise, demanding questions. He answered them as best he could. He found that the process of articulating his intuitions to someone who was going to push on every one of them was useful. It sharpened things that had been fuzzy, clarified things that had been half-formed. By the end of the 4 hours, he had a better understanding of what he'd done and why it had worked than he'd had going into them. The 17 channels, Dr. Soon said. You interpreted them as simultaneous emotional registers. Yes. Why? 'Cause. He tried to assemble the reasoning. Because the variations between them weren't random. They weren't echoes or signal degradation artifacts. They were deliberate. And they weren't different messages. They were different qualities of the same message, the same meaning, felt differently. And you think that's meaningful about their psychology? That they would transmit the same greeting in 17 emotional variations simultaneously? I think it's meaningful about their communication style. I don't know if it maps onto psychology in the way we'd understand it. Yes. I think they've developed a way of speaking that encodes emotional register directly into the signal, rather than sequentially or contextually. They're not saying, hello, and by the way, we're cautious. Two separate things. They're saying, cautious, hello, as one thing. Dr. Soon was quiet for a moment. That's either the most sophisticated form of communication we've ever encountered, or it's something else entirely, and you've been reading your own projections into a signal you couldn't parse. I know, he said. That's been my problem from the start. It's everyone's problem in this field, she said. Was not entirely reassuring, but was somehow better than being told he was wrong. The return run began on day 14. The freighters were lighter now, empty holds. The agricultural equipment and habitat modules and 40,000 tons of grain delivered. Supply chain closed. They moved faster. The convoy was quieter. Kale spent the transit days working with Dr. Soon's team, building the translation framework into something more rigorous and more defensible. Testing interpretations against each other, arguing about structure. He had not expected to enjoy it. He found that he did. He also found himself thinking at odd moments about the Velmaran procession, holding position 400 kilometers off a point in space that was now empty, waiting. Whether they had some equivalent of what he felt in those moments of anticipation, the forward-leaning quality of almost, preek, of chance, nearly, of something about to happen. He thought they probably did. He thought the greeting in 17 registers had been the output of a very long, almost. They received the signal on day 8 of the return run. Still 3 days out from the rendezvous point. 17 channels. The familiar structure. But different. He had his instruments on it within seconds of the board, lighting up, and he sat with the analysis for a long time before he called Dr. Soon. They've changed it, he said when she arrived. She looked at the analysis. How? The structure is the same. The 17 channels are the same. But the quality, the emotional registers. He pointed to the readings. Before, I described it as hello in 17 emotional registers. This is, he searched, this is halo in 17 registers. But the registers are different. Before, there was one that felt like caution, one that felt like. He was aware he was using words loosely, like hope that wasn't fully allowed. One that felt like very long practice. Those aren't here now. What's here instead? Certain. I don't have enough framework to be precise. He looked at the signal. It feels like they know we're coming. Like they can tell the difference between the convoy holding position and the convoy moving toward them, and the signal has changed to account for that. Dr. Soon was quiet. It feels like welcome, she said. Yes, he said. That's the word I was reaching for. It feels like welcome. The rendezvous happened at 1100 on day 11. The Velmoran procession was exactly where it had been 11 weeks before, which was something that should not have surprised Kale and did anyway. He had spent 11 weeks thinking about them. He had not entirely accounted for the fact that they had spent 11 weeks thinking about him. Not him specifically, the convoy, the returning ships, the humans who had said, "Team, we'll come back," and had then come back. He was at his station when they came into visual range. He had not planned to be emotional about it. He was not a person who was generally emotional at his station. But there was something about the way the procession looked on the visual screen, 322 objects, the same loose geometry, the shape that a community made when it moved together, that got into his chest in a way he could not entirely manage. He thought about the love songs they had listened to for 160 years. All the human love songs, traveling outward at the speed of light, reaching a receiver 200 light years away, being cataloged and kept and listened to again. Perhaps you listened to music that meant something to you. He thought about what it would mean to spend 160 years listening to someone else's love songs and never having anyone to send your own to. He picked up the transmission controls. Dr. Soon was beside him now, 3 members of her team. They had prepared this. They had a sequence. A proper first contact response, rigorous and structured, theoretically sound. "Voss," she said. "I know," he said. "I know we have the sequence. Then, can I go first?" Just briefly, before the sequence. She looked at him for a moment. "What are you going to say?" He thought about it. "What do you say to something that has been waiting for you? What do you say to something that learns how to heal in 17 ways, so that, no matter what you were feeling when it found you, it would reach you?" "I'm going to say we're back," he said. "I'm going to say we came back." Dr. Soon looked at the signal, looked at the board, looked at him. 30 seconds, she said. Then the sequence. He nodded. He opened the channel on the frequency they had built together, the carrier structure they had made from the ruins of a prime sequence, and 160 years of human radio transmissions. And he transmitted. He did not transmit. "We're back." In words, because they did not share words. He transmitted it in the structure they had built together. The patterns of approach and acknowledgement, and the specific doubled mirroring that he had come to associate with reciprocity, with "we will also's," with the keeping of promises. And he transmitted the number 11, because 11 weeks was what they had said, and 11 weeks was what had passed, and specificity he had learned was a form of respect. The response came back in 40 seconds. 17 channels. The welcome register, all 17, and something new. Something he had never seen in the signal before. Something that sat at the center of all 17 channels, like a note the others were built around. He stared at it for a long time. "What is it?" Dr. Soon asked. Kale thought about the love songs. About 160 years of listening. About the greeting that assumed you understood what a greeting was, because they had been listening to your greetings. For so long they knew them by heart. "I think," he said carefully, "it's their equivalent of relief." He thought that was probably right. He thought that something had been waiting 160 years to be known, and had then had to wait 11 more weeks to see if the knowing would begin, and had now watched the convoy come back on schedule, and found its signal answered. That something might reasonably feel relief. He thought he understood the feeling. He stepped aside. Dr. Soon sat down at the board, her team arranging themselves around her, and the real work began. He went and stood by the observation port at the back of the bay, where you could see the stars if you stood at the right angle, and looked out at them, and thought about everything that was about to happen, and felt the particular feeling of being present at the beginning of something. Not the hero of it, not the center of it, but there, at the hinge of it, having been the one to turn the handle. He thought, In 160 years, they heard 4 billion of our signals. He thought, this one is going to count. He turned back to his station and got to work. End. Story log update.